must be born again and again and again and again and again. So every Sunday night I'd come forward to the altar, and one Sunday night my dad came up and he said, Ron, do you have your Bible? And I said, yeah, I have it. I had this little red Bible. And he said, write this date down. You're saved. Don't come up here again. he regretted that later because I could have used the second tip, and the third tip, and the fourth tip. But so I knew I was saved, and I knew I was called to ministry at a very, very early age. It was so great that I chose rebellion over religion. Now, here's the thing. Rebellion is just another bounded set. It's not really freedom. And so it wasn't that I share with you this morning is my testimony. If there's any teaching I do that is kind of the testimony of what God did in me to set me free, this is it. So, bounded set versus centered set. Here's the origin of this phrase. Dr. Paul Hebert, who was a missionary anthropologist, he was teaching at Fuller Seminary when I was there. I was in a lecture with him, and he was talking about bounded set cultures versus centered set cultures. And it was this anthropology lecture preparing missionaries. Is a culture that's very rigid and narrow and prescribed as to what you must do to be accepted in this culture and what you must not do in order to stay accepted in this culture. And he was kind of coaching these missionaries because many of them were going to Asia. And Asian culture tends to be very bounded set. If you do certain things, you violate the mores of that culture, you absolutely eliminate your chance to speak into that culture. And so it's important for missionaries to understand this phenomenon. Things you must never do, things you must do in order to be accepted. And then he compared that to centered set culture. Now, centered set culture, much more relational, much more fluid. The boundaries are not as rigid. It's much more focused on relationship. And he talked about South American cultures where there's much more fluidity between the cultures in South America, and it's more focused on relationship. So I started to think of churches. In the pastor that I am, I went, oh, wait a minute. There are churches that are bounded set churches. In fact, when intimacy with God, when the sacred romance with God is lost, a church becomes a bounded set culture. And you set up a list of things you must never do in order to be accepted in this church, and a list of things you must always do in order to be accepted in this church. And as he was going on in his lecture, I actually wrote my own lecture on how do we set not only the church free from bounded set Christianity, but also people free. And so hence the origin of this talk. Now, I want to start with this quote. It comes from a book called The Sacred Romance by Brent Curtis and John Eldridge. He says this sacred romance is set within all churches. It is the core of our spiritual journey. Any religion that ignores this sacred romance survives only as guilt-induced legalism, a set of propositions to be memorized and rules to be obeyed. Now, what Brent Curtis is saying there is that when a church or a group of people experience intimacy with God, an encounter with God, a revival, they have this encounter that transforms their lives, and they begin to do certain things out of that romance and out of that intimacy, and they begin to say, when the time passes in between when God has visited this church, this group, with a visitation of the Spirit, now things have kind of fallen into a status quo. And what happens is, when a church loses this passion, they set up rules and regulations to control. Is that young people are running away from the bounded set. They're not running away from Jesus. They're not really running away from the idea of a God who loves them. They're running away. Bounded set produces people that do the right things externally, but their heart is lagging behind. And so centered set, relational intimacy with God, it's messier up front. It takes longer. There's much more of a developmental process. But in the end, you get people that are sold out for Jesus, not just from the surface, but from the core of their being. So right up front, I want to go off on this definition of spiritual formation by Robert Mulholland. Spiritual formation, true spiritual formation, is the process of being transformed into the image of Christ for the sake of others. Two things I want to say. First of all, it is a relational process. All the right things and avoiding all the wrong things. It is a relationship with Jesus. Now, let me show you this in Scripture from a man who escaped the bound and set. His name is Paul. And in Philippians chapter 3, here's what we read. Paul says, whatever was a good Christian is always happy. A good Christian is never depressed. A good Christian is never angry. And so what happens is you get the ride to church, and I know some of you don't ride in the car to church, but when my kids were little, and we would take the car with 4 kids in the back seat to church, and I had to preach or lead worship, I remember that the car was a sight of incredible